Hi, welcome to the Equity Clinic. I'm Omitra Berry. My husband and I had both wanted to visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture since it first opened in 2016. A few weeks ago, realizing we hadn't planned a spring vacay, I checked to see if we could get timed entry passes. We could. I checked for flights and a hotel that would fit our timetable. I found them. We managed to get timed entry passes for 2 consecutive days, and I highly recommend you do the same. Because to fully take in the content, to come to grips with many of the things that you will see and learn, to allow yourself to feel the emotions that will arise and process through the cognitive dissonance you'll experience, you're going to need 2 days. Because it begins before we in America, who share as many as 16 generations of African blood, were bred here. Because it begins before 16 generations of blood were shed on this continent for this country. And it begins before the 16 generations of the diaspora that the socio-political economic institution of slavery dispersed across North and South America and throughout the Caribbean, were enslaved. When you begin the journey through this museum, you start with Imperial Africa. You descend several stories to learn first of African city-states and nation-states of the 15th century. You learn of the wealth of the African continent and the global economy it shared based on the trade of gold, salt, and spices with Europe and Asia. You learn of the African continent's diversity of peoples and religions, the queendoms and kingdoms. The ones never addressed in K-12 social sciences frameworks for world history. As you walk on, you begin to learn in hard numbers the human cost of the transatlantic passage. Ship after ship is detailed with a count of its human inventory, a commodity Europeans and European Americans traded for economic profit, a commodity they required to build wealth, to do the work they were physically incapable of performing. Ships like the Mentor of France, which on January 28, 1738, boarded 700 enslaved Africans and landed with just 384 survivors, 54%. But shipping companies were compensated for their losses by insurers, primarily Lloyd's of London. Numbers like 5.8 million, the number of African captives transported across the Atlantic between 1441 and 1836 by Portugal alone. That's 14,683 humans per year for 395 years. That's 1,223 humans per month, about the enrollment of the average high school in America, month after month, for 395 years. Facts, numbers, people, our systems don't want us to teach of, a history many don't want to have our children learn. Moving on, you journey through colonial North America to examine the paradox of liberty in the founding of this nation. You learn of life for enslaved and free Africans and the beginnings of Blackness as a race equated with slavery in this nation. You learn of the violence of the institution of slavery, a violence supported with arguments of Christianity by the enslavers. You learn of the everyday violence foisted upon enslaved Africans on southern plantations who lived on an average of only 7 years in such horrific conditions. On the walls, you read the value of a Black life in dollars and cents, detailed by written records, and the absolute need for enslaved Africans to fight the British for white Americans' freedom. The paradox. On the wall in towering letters, several stories high, is an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence beginning with the words, "All men are created equal." Standing in this part of the exhibit, you learn of the construction of our nation's capital by enslaved labor. From the Capitol building to the Smithsonian Castle to the Executive Mansion, the place we now call the White House, a designation of bigoted origin by Theodore Roosevelt. Beyond the copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, you examine handwritten correspondence between Benjamin Banneker and Thomas Jefferson, of gifts of humans, of Negro slaves from one generation to the next. It becomes more and more difficult to reconcile the words of our founding documents with the facts, the evidence you're examining as you continue through our nation's history. On the wall are finance and banknotes. $2.5 million worth of slave-based bonds were purchased by European investors in 1828. $25.7 million of bank credit was issued in Louisiana alone from mortgaging enslaved African Americans from mortgaging people in 1859. $250 million, the value of cotton produced by enslaved African Americans in 1861. And $3.1 billion. Yes, I said billion with a B like boy. $3.1 billion, the value assigned to enslaved African Americans in 1860. The value of a human being in dollars and cents, in mortgages and investment devices, in wealth created and held and transferred by white Americans for 16 generations, from which those held in bondage were never compensated. Something to sit with. And once again, the absolute need for enslaved Africans to fight for the Confederacy in the place of their privileged white enslavers to maintain the institution that held them in bondage. The paradox. But there are also the stories of the building of a Black culture, of creating a way out of no way, of building a life and a community under constant threat of separation, violence, and death, for everything from learning to read to loving who you love, all because of the color of your skin. But it was here we chose to pause on day one. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.